there would be multiple generations that would be crippled by the not being able to use GPS capability. And you know, and not just that, but when you think about different ways that other countries use their space capabilities, a lot of countries rely on space for things like monitoring climate, right? When you think about, like, say, Africa strategy, when you think about some of the uses, Canada's space strategy, different countries have different strategies and different uses.
Hello, welcome to the Space Policy Show. I'm Colleen Stover with the Aerospace Corporation. Episode 142 features two experts in the field of defense space and political science. The core of their conversation is about the militarization of space and the security dilemma. How do you manage escalation? What constitutes a weapon? Who defines the rules? And why do we care? But they actually cover a range of topics, from the Death Star to Elvira, from arms control to Afrofuturism. So we are pleased to host Dr. Nola Haynes, an expert in national security and foreign policy, and adjunct professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. She's a person of many talents. Jennifer Cannon is leading the conversation, and she's part of our government relations team here at Aerospace. I think you're going to like this one. Over to Jen in the studio.
Thanks, Colleen. Today we have Nola Haynes here with us. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm really excited to talk about space policy and space weapons.
I'm excited to talk to you about those things too. When we first met, and I noticed you had the same kind of nerd energy that I have, and I was like, when the idea of this podcast came up, I was like, I'm so excited to talk to you about these things. Yeah. Especially as women in this space. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for joining us to talk about this today. So the first thing I'd like you to talk about is a little bit about your background in space policy, maybe the non-proliferation space, and what you've been doing the last few years.
Ooh, that is an interesting story. So I was thinking about this on the drive here because my foray into space actually began in terrorism. So interestingly enough, I found myself in the international security space when I was in grad school buku years ago, and it was during the Boston bombings. And at the same time, I just so happened to be taking Arabic. And so while I was researching something else, the reality of the Boston bombings just completely changed the trajectory of my research career. And fast forward some years, get into my PhD program, and I'm doing all of this research on global terrorism to read all of these papers about how it's declining. That's really not the largest threat anymore. We can't say that today, sitting here in 2024, because it's on the rise again. But at that time, global terrorism was on a decline. And I read this one national security legal paper, I think, because I was doing a lot of work on state-sponsored terrorism and sanctions. And I read this one paper, and it's like, well, global terrorism isn't actually what we need to worry about. It's illegal proliferation of nuclear materials. And I was like, ooh. And so that was another pivot. So then I got really, really into weapons. Like, I spent a really, really not so good amount of time studying ICBMs. Like, if you looked in my search history back then, you're like, what is this woman up to?
I understand that obsession.
I'm sure you do. So then I started spending a lot of time there. And then I started teaching arms control and international security at Pepperdine. And so being drawn to like contracts and agreements and treaties, I was drawn to arms control. And so I was spending a lot of time there. I was just looking through different weapon systems, looking at kind of Russia's dormant hypersonic program. And then all of a sudden in 2021, China just shocks the world with this glide vehicle test. Like, wait a minute, what? And so I started spending an inordinate amount of time with hypersonic weapons.
Before we get to that glide vehicle test, we're going to get to that later. I want to talk a little bit about what we see in popular culture and how that relates to nonproliferation and weapons in space. And so, growing up as a Star Wars nerd, 1977 movie came out and the Death Star exploded. And so everybody understands or has seen that, the Death Star blows up in this fireball. Mm-hmm. But is that what space weapons really are? So, what is a real space weapon? Can we define it?
Can I define a real space weapon? So I'm going to back up a little bit, and we're going to talk about popular culture, because that factors in largely as to why I'm sitting here today. So I'm going to go all the way back to New Orleans, Louisiana, where I was born. And so if you spent any time in New Orleans, there is this magical quality to the place. And so my mama, may she rest in peace, she was a big sci-fi person and fantasy. My mom was such a huge Trekkie. Oh my goodness. She loved Star Trek. And so all of these kind of magical ideas were just in my head as a kid. And so space had this special place in my imagination, right? And I think for a lot of people, space is this imaginary place. And I know for the Black community especially, there is this level of futurism. It's called Afrofuturism, Black futurism, where you think about space as this place where no isms exist, right? Every type of creature, color coexist together, right? There's no type of colonization. All the icky stuff that we've done here on Earth doesn't translate to space. So all of that hope and excitement, watching Uhura, Star Trek with the thing in her ear, and Captain Kirk kissing green women. So it's always like this hope thing. And so, talking about the Death Star, I remember watching that as a kid, and I was just kind of like, that's the bad stuff that, we don't want to happen in space. And so I think when people hear things like weapons in space, Space Force, they think of the Death Star because people have this fantasy about what space is and that it's so advanced, and I think people really think it's far more advanced up there than what it really is, but I think people really do have fears that that's what we're moving towards,
right? Especially
if we're having conversations about weapons in space.
Right. Well, since we now know that weapons in space are not the Death Star, as much as we'd like to, what is out there right now, defensively and offensively, that we might consider a weapon, a space weapon?
A space weapon. I think about directed energy weapons quite a bit. I just sitting around thinking about weapons. Kinetic ASATs, non-kinetic ASATs, but
anti-satellite.
Yes. Oh, thank you. Yep. Sorry. Anti-satellite. I think about the potential capability that directed energy weapons can possess. At least in my mind, I think probably going back to that Star Wars, world that many of us grew up in, and thinking about the potential development of that capability. So I think about that quite a bit.
Okay.
It's a departure from one ASAT bumping into another ASAT. Like, this is something targeted, it's powerful, and it has the potential to develop into something not quite the Death Star, but inching closer to something that maybe we don't want to see in space.
Yeah, and I like your background of working on terrorism before you got to space, and we'll go more into pop culture on this, but you can think of Star Wars as the terrorists against the good guys. And so that's kind of what it is, how it feels, right now?
Yes, actually, another pop culture reference. So I started my space security course last semester watching For All Mankind.
Yes.
And we started my students were so upset because we didn't watch the whole thing. And so I kind of threw them in, I think, to like maybe the third episode where they're in space and Americans find out that Russia's up to something, right? There's some level of spying going on. And then you could see that's the moment where the arms race starts. Security dilemma gets wrapped into all of these things. And so when you think about the type of espionage that happens in a situation in space where you have to rely on sensor capability, in a way, terrorism has so much to do with spying, seeing what the other group is up to, seeing how they operate, seeing what their response times are, all these different things. So I get a little nervous when I apply my terrorism hat to where some of this can go. But to your point, just like when we talk, I know we're going to talk about militarization a little later, but a big part of that is, reconnaissance. It's the toolkit of spying, right? And so,
well, that's how it started, right? How space, the militarization of space started. And so, since you already segued into that, first of all, I'm really interested in how you would apply the security dilemma to the militarization of space. And then from there, why have we had to weaponize?
Right. So security dilemma is something I'm spending a large amount of time on right now. I'm actually writing a paper in a very theoretical IR, international relations sense, in that can we claim it's an actual security dilemma if there's no real space governance, therefore it's anarchy? That's nerd stuff. But to your point.
Can you explain the security dilemma to the layperson?
So security dilemma is a situation where the Cold War is one of the strongest examples, right? The US and Russia at times guessing what the other country is up to. And that guesswork creates this void of not knowing. And so that not knowing space is then when the country goes back and say, well, I think they're developing this weapon, so we need to develop a weapon that's even better than that weapon, right? So we can detect that weapon before they're even done making the weapon. So it's this guesswork that happens that contributes to this buildup, right? To this capabilities buildup. So unfortunately, because of the sensor capability in space, and there really aren't eyes, that can kind of see things, because there's that information gap, you kind of are back in a situation where you're like, okay, is China developing AI capable kinetic ASATs with directed energy weapons capabilities? We don't know. They might be. So let's then design something that's even scarier and bigger, right? And make sure we can detect them before they can detect us. So it's this constant ping pong of guessing what the enemy or adversary is doing.
And the concern is how far are you going to go with that, right?
I mean, look where we are. Look where we're sitting today. I mean, between the U.S. and Russia's nuclear stockpile, I mean, that tells you everything you need to know as to how far this can go.
And it used to be that we didn't have access to space and we couldn't put intelligence capabilities or surveillance capabilities in space, but now we can. And so some people have said that that's militarizing space, right? Putting those intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets up there. And most people would say that started with Sputnik, right? So this has been going on for 60 years. Can you talk about, not the whole last 60 years, but I'd really like to talk more about when we've started to focus on the weapons aspect. Once we knew that space needed to be militarized to be able to succeed.
Day zero?
Okay, yeah.
So a lot of people are paying attention to space now, as you know, but there was this lull after, we made it to the moon and this excitement about NASA and all the different missions. And then, there were a few accidents that really turned people off from, space watching. But what people do not realize is, yes, the purpose of space, according to the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, is exploration, with partner countries, not not having military goals, right? However, we are still talking about a Cold War framework. We're not too long out of World War II. So there's a lot of distrust that's happening, and there absolutely is a race. So it was more than just the space race. It was also, okay, what's Russia doing up there in space again? And then Russia, what's the United States doing up in space again? So ASAT technology is not a new technology. We're talking about it more. It's more advanced, but it is not a new technology. So if you think about ASAT technology from the positionality of intelligence gathering, then that's the kind of subtle line between weaponization and militarization. So if the intention for that ASAT is command and control, recon, intelligence gathering, that's the militarization aspect because it's serving military goals. Weaponization is where an ASAT can be turned into a weapon. It's a slippery slope. So it's the idea of it can be turned into a weapon.
Right. So there are a lot of things up there right now that can be turned into weapons.
1000%. Absolutely. So all that to say that ASAT technology is not new. It's more advanced. Since day one, there's been this Cold War tension that has played out in space. And fast forwarding, one of the reasons why debris is such a big issue right now is from all the old satellite technology from these ASATs that have been roaming around in space. So while I know there's a lot of eyes on space right now, and I'm very happy about that, none of this stuff happened yesterday.
Right. It's been coming slowly, and the public is just starting to open its eyes to it. Yeah, so space has always been militarized since, Sputnik went up. What is different today, say in the last, since 2007, since China put that anti-satellite weapon up? What have we seen that's different now, and why are we a little more worried?
Not too long after that, the United States made a hard pivot towards security, space security. Bush II administration started talking a lot about space security. And also, another thing as we think about Space Force, a lot of people think that's a new development, but it isn't. That conversation's been ongoing through several administrations, right? So what's different now, where we have a dual-use system, I think people would make the argument that it's more mil-civ than civ-mil. Civilian, military, military, civilian, right?
Right.
So putting military first and then civilian coming second, this hard pivot towards security, a palpable pivot, not just subtle over time. So I would say one of the strongest differences in thinking about, I'm going to forget the year, the offset strategy where space security was explicit. We are leaning more into that objective in a way that earlier space exploration, when it was all about NASA, didn't. Especially at least in the public domain, in the public's imagination. So that's one difference, the hard pivot towards space security. Commercialization of space, that's another huge difference. And then we have Space Force, right? And a lot of people actually don't know that there actually is a huge partnership component with Space Force and commercial entities, that a lot of this innovation is happening because of that partnership.
Right.
So those are some of the newer developments.
Since we are more focused on the military side, that would be the Space Force and all of their branches. That would be the National Reconnaissance Office versus NASA, right? Which Americans used to always focus on. And so let's talk about that fractional orbital bombardment system hypersonic glide vehicle, or the FOBS HGV, that we saw the People's Republic of China launch in 2021. And that's what got you really excited. That's the time I started to focus on space policy also. So it was a very exciting time for a lot of us. How has that changed normal people's perception of threats and space and how it affects them?
The way that you started, I think in people's imagination, it evokes the Death Star, right? In a way that we're inching closer to something that maybe we don't want to see in space.
Yeah.
And that was such a pivotal moment because it kind of woke the world up, not just to the advancement of that capability that, again, that's been around for a while, mm-hmm. but it woke people up to a reality that space is a domain where security threats are real. And I think that was another pivotal moment in the way that this has escalated, the way that I'll never forget. I think it was the Financial Times that had an article that said, "We're in an armed space race." And so I sat down with a team and we wrote a paper. We presented on it in Montreal. Like, everyone was like, "There's a new Cold War in space." That terminology was bandied around a lot. Mm-hmm. And then I started reading things. I started calming down. And, the reality of, well, yes, glide vehicles, the two different types, are very powerful. They're hard to detect. You can see when they take off, but you can't see where they're going to land, all these different things. Then I started reading some articles saying, just like with AI, maybe they're not as much of a threat to space as the initial kind of panic and chaos, right? Yeah. Definitely a threat to our industrial base, but in terms of, can a hypersonic be launched up into LEO and like destroy
low Earth orbit?
Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. I got you. Yeah.
Is it going to destroy all of NASA's 12 satellites? Is it going to destroy this constellation of satellites?
Like, should normal citizens be concerned about that capability? Because it could hold any target at risk, right? And not knowing that it's there.
I would be more worried as a loved one of a person who's in the military on a carrier. Mm-hmm. In a very real sense, yes. Hypersonics are stealthy by nature. And right now, where detection technology is, it's not where it needs to be. So I think about it as a terrestrial threat more than like a threat to LEO, GEO. Right. You know what I mean?
I agree.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right. So now that we've talked about the weapons, maybe what a space weapon is, what some threats are that you see and you see in the future, let's talk about how the international community is dealing with that and what they've tried to do to stop the proliferation of these potential weapons. Mm-hmm. And so the United Nations and the United States and other countries have tried to come up with new treaties that kind of update the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. Mm-hmm. And so what are some of those treaties, and do you think any of those would be effective?
So here's the rub. I'm going to use a term that I know people in the space community don't like, space governance. Mm-hmm. Because technically, space is legally supposed to be ungoverned.
Right. Per the Outer Space Treaty.
Exactly. Per the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. There are limitations to what some of the Moon Treaty, PPWT, there are limits as to how far those agreements in theory can go, right? And because different states in a UN context have voting power, maybe not all states sign on, maybe not all states recognize what one group of states are doing over here. Mm-hmm. The latest iteration of Paros through the UN Security Council, where, we got credible intelligence that Russia was trying to place a nuclear weapon in space, and a part of LEO that's largely uninhabited, right? Mm-hmm. So then countries came together and said, oh, wait, maybe that's not a great idea. Mm-hmm. And so they wanted to strengthen PAROS.
The Prevention of Arms Race in Outer Space.
There we go.
Okay.
Yep, that.
Talk about the arms race again.
Yeah. To my memory, China abstained, Russia vetoed the vote, and then Russia and China came back with its own version of the treaty, and other states did not sign on. So it's that politicking that happens that can really congest the potency of very much needed arms control measures. But again, because technically there is no governing system in space, it makes it very challenging.
So do you think treaties like that, I would say more of a soft deterrence, are useful for nonproliferation? Or if they're not, are there other ways to go about trying to stop other people from proliferating?
Well, in one way, I mean, it's the basic kind of lever that's being pulled of, okay, we're watching you, we see you, we have eyes on you. Like, y'all trying to do some shady stuff, but we see you. And we're not the only ones that see you. All of our friends in the background see you too, so we're watching you. In that regard, perhaps that can be effective.
More of that naming and shaming campaign.
Exactly, right? So where Russia's device was clandestine at one point, it is not any longer. I have been to so many talks about this potential device. And if Russia moves its toe, in a wrong direction, it's going to be a lot of pressure, not just from the United States, but also from partners and allies.
So why is this device so worrisome?
Because unlike the capability of a hypersonic that can pierce LEO, but then come back into the atmosphere or below it, you're actually talking about a device in LEO that can absolutely destroy satellite constellations. So it can cut off our GPS every day, our GPS systems. That's not just a military capability, right? That is public use. It can cut off command and control. So, I mean, it's not a nothing burger.
Right.
It's definitely something to be concerned with. And then the way that deterrence has played out historically, you have one, I might have to get one. So as an arms control person, as a diplomacy first person, I am hoping that the name and shame, of PAROS, of our partners and allies, can be an effective tool against placing something so powerful.
And earlier you talked about the commercialization of space, and now we're talking about a potential weapon that could destroy those commercial assets. So what does that mean to the commercial space enterprise? And then you kind of alluded to it a little bit, but what does that mean for the normal Earth citizen if we lose our GPS or our position navigation and timing or our Starlink?
Well, you can ask Ukraine about what Starlink means to them, I mean, we have to go back to our Thomas guides. I mean, I'm not trying to make light of it, but there would be multiple generations that would be crippled by the not being able to use GPS capability. And not just that, but when you think about different ways that other countries use their space capabilities, a lot of countries rely on space for things like monitoring climate, right? When you think about, like, say, Africa's strategy, when you think about some of the uses, Canada's space strategy, different countries have different strategies and different uses. And the US is chided for seemingly being mil-civ and not civ-mil, where other space strategies, other countries are definitely focused on things like monitoring climate, because they need to be able to predict where a drought pattern is going to happen, to maybe stave off conflict, right?
So it might increase conflict.
Absolutely.
Or people might not have enough food Okay.
Absolutely. So the relationship between space technology and climate is a very strong relationship. And there are so many climate issues around the world that's increasing. Being able to have satellites to monitor and to predict literally saves lives.
Yeah, and that's a part of security, just like we've been talking about, right? And it may not be the security that I normally think of when it comes to the military, but it's human security.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
You wouldn't be able to fly one of your fancy planes without that.
Good thing I
Without
have
space tech.
old navigation tools.
Just like a Thomas guide.
And you know, just a little anecdote on that. So when GPS jammers were becoming really big in the early 2000s, we had to focus on navigating without GPS. So our internal navigation system, and then just looking outside and being like, oh, that river's there. You know?
Oh my goodness.
So that's how it affected us in the military, you know, when I was
Wow.
flying. And we had to learn to use those backups. That's not what we want to do. But
No. I don't want to carry around a thick Thomas guide anymore. I just don't.
All right, so I have a few more questions, and I want to quickly go through this next one.
Yeah.
But what do you see on the horizon for space weapons, as we call them? Is there anything new that we should be looking out for?
Well, as we expand with space exploration, you know, thinking about Artemis, the Artemis Accords, which is a wonderful diplomatic attempt to kind of get back to the intentions of space exploration and keeping to the foundational ideals of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. However, because we're humans, the more we explore cislunar areas, or the more we explore, there's always going to be the specter of threat, right? And what I fear is the more exploration, the more thinking around developing capabilities that can keep missions safe.
Right.
Because in this, we're calling it strategic competition, this context that we're all living in right now, it is not this situation where every country wants to hold hands and explore space together. We're not living in that kind of world, and that is the unfortunate reality.
Right, so thinking more about cislunar activities and what could potentially happen as we go out toward the moon again. Yeah. All right, let's end on a good note. And, you know, maybe something our listeners, if they're interested in this topic, how can they get involved? How can they go do something to help with space security?
Oh, well, you know, I honestly, this is going to sound like a plug, and I am not trying to plug. I'm not. But Space Force, they're looking for people. Like, I'm not kidding. They really are. Like, they're looking for people. And it's not quite what you think. It's not like, you know, they're going to have on their white kind of uniforms like in Star Wars. You know, that's where we're not talking about space soldiers. The Guardians aren't necessarily.
Not yet.
Not yet. Not yet. But they are looking for people. And then also, too, I see, you know what, especially if you're in the DMV area, or if you're in any area that has NASA, go to NASA.
NASA's all over the country.
Oh,
yep.
Oh my goodness. Just, you get to see in real time the way GPS works, the way it tracks different weather systems and crops, and it's just so magical. NASA is so magical.
Yes.
And that's kind of like, I encourage young folks to start thinking about space as a reality. I'm writing a white paper right now with a co-chair from my space security law and policy working group, and we're focusing on an idea called Beyond STEM. And what that means is we need policymakers, we need lawyers, it's all persons on deck. You know, if
Nola, you know I'm a geography major, and now I'm working in space.
We talked
right?
about that.
Yeah,
Exactly.
right.
We
So
need
anybody can do
everyone.
this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm a political scientist,
Yeah.
so we need everyone, right? So it's building out the space ecosystem in a way that touches every part of American society.
Right.
And I think about Canada's space strategy a lot, because that's how they've built their kind of space ecosystem, that every part of their economy has something to do with space.
Everyone has a place in space, as we like to say.
Yes, absolutely. So that's the exciting part, right?
Yeah, it is really exciting.
Go to NASA first.
Open up your imagination, get excited about what could be, right? Yeah.
Unfortunately, SpaceX is leaving California and it's going to Texas. Is it going to Texas, Florida? Wherever it's going.
Okay.
There are commercial entities now where you can go there. You know, they're public days. But man, there's nothing like NASA. I'm sorry. Like I'll never not be a NASA kid. It's so exciting.
I absolutely love this conversation. Thank you. I am excited to go forth and do great things with you, hopefully in the future.
Absolutely.
And I hope everybody else can, if they're interested in this, can reach out to somebody who might be able to help to get them in the door in the space community, because we need everyone, like we were just talking about.
And Georgetown students, you can come take my class. You can take my space security class. That's a good way.
Yeah.
You never know who might speak in my class.
You never know. I think that's a good plug.
There we go.
Great way to end it. So again, thank you, Dr. Nola Haynes, for coming and being on the Space Policy Show.
I told you you would enjoy it. What a great discussion on the many facets of how space reflects on our national security and on our everyday imagination. Thank you both. And thank you to our audience. This episode is part of a series on resilience, and other topics include launch with ULA's CEO Tori Bruno, space alliances with Australia, and Asia-Pacific regional security from Japan's perspective. All shows are available on YouTube or wherever you get podcasts. You can go to our website, csps.aerospace.org, or follow us on LinkedIn to get notified of new shows and our in-depth research on space policy and strategy. Thank you to James Liggins, our technical director, and thank you for watching.